Good morning. This is Pastor Barbara, aka Preacher with Ports, Preacher with Parrots. It's going to be one of those mornings, I think. Today is April 5th. This is Easter Sunday morning, 2015. And the birds that I have with me today are the cockatiels. The one leaning up against right here, this one is a couple of days more than 5 weeks. She's at the stage where she's beginning to eat soft foods, trying to learn how to crack a seed, and at the same time, her parents are feeding her. What Father is doing right there is trying to pick some pin feathers, and the baby doesn't like it. They're in there together. This father was one that would not let the mother on in the nest area once the babies were born. And so I had to keep, that's being fed right now. That's Daddy feeding the baby. They do it by locking beaks this way. So most people don't get to see this in their lifetime, but you have just seen Daddy, because both Daddy and Mama will feed the babies. This is the first that they can all be together without fighting, and that's because it's the first that we've been able to remove the nest box. It's being in the nest that the father will not allow the mother to be present when he's there. So I've been keeping them separate. But since the baby is now able to be out of the nest, well, there we go. Today, what I'm going to do is a little bit strange. I'm not exactly going to preach another man's sermon, but I want to comment and share with you what another California minister has preached. If you're in Southern California, no, nobody's distracting me. I'm distracting myself when I look around. I'm doing a live show as well as making this video. And usually I don't look at the chat box and until I get through making the video. But that's something I do all on my own. I don't need anybody to help me distract myself. If you're in Southern California, and from some people around, have heard of Dr. Gene Scott. He has one or possibly two PhDs from Stanford University in Northern California. He's a very brilliant man. For years, I had heard that he had preached this sermon in which he was proving the resurrection of Jesus. All of us who have seen Dr. Scott, and for years he preached on Channel 30 in Los Angeles. He pastored a church. He had a couple of other churches, I think. He referred to them, if memory serves me, as king's houses. He also, toward the end, was renting a large, old artistic theater from downtown Los Angeles, and he called it something like University Temple or University Church, something like that. He's a very brilliant man. He did things which irritated other preachers and which irritated some people. He would smoke a cigar while he was preaching. One time, and by the way, I want to give you the background for the information and where I got it so that you'll understand how I'm using it and the fact that it is quite appropriate for me to do so. I have a statement from somebody by the name of Addison B. Bachman. He was an admirer of Dr. Gene Scott, and this is his disclaimer. If I could have found this sermon, I believe it probably exists with Pastor Melissa, his widow. I'm sure because he did the same sermon a couple of times. and I'm sure that they have a tape for it. But I could not find it. I've looked for it for a few years because since I heard that he had done this, I wanted to watch it for my own benefit as well as trying to share it. Couldn't find it, but a few days ago, I found it in writing. And I did find one still shot, which perhaps I'll be able to share with you. Uh, he used to write on a big chalkboard his notes. And after he preached this the first time, he preached it on subsequent Easter Sunday mornings. And I have a still shot where he has the very outline I'm going to be using with you on the background. This is Mr. Bachman's disclaimer. The original copy of Resurrection Pulpit, reprinted below, which I'm going to read. Make a few comments, but basically just read his material for you in English and downloadable in Armenian and Indonesian, were given to me on a disc by the copyright holder, Pastor Melissa Scott. Dr. Jean Scott legally passed material onto her. The ministry ordained her and so forth. Now, Mr. Bachman says that he has this on a disc, and it was given to him by Pastor Melissa, which has the legal right to use these materials, and gave him verbal permission to electronically display and or distribute in honor of the ministry and memory of the late Dr. Gene Scott. His name was William Eugene Scott, but his degree, I believe, was given to Dr. Gene Scott, and that's how he was known. It was originally this particular writing of it in Armenian and in Indonesia. It's their own things which Pastor Melissa Scott oversees. I believe you can get by going to Christianity, which is christiansanity.org. I'm going to let you see that if you can up here. Well, I can do it. No, I guess I can't do a better job than that. christiansanity.org. He gives his testimony. He talks about going to college and losing his faith and so forth. And then he gets down to what this message is all about. He starts out with a number of assumptions, and we'll do those first. In other words, if I were to say to you, I began preaching Easter Sunday at 7 minutes to 11. You have the assumption that I finished the sermon. I mean, if I tell you, or if I could prove to you that I started preaching at a certain time, it's logical that the time came when I stopped preaching. He starts out with a number of assumptions which are not breaking the back of intelligent logic by making certain assumptions. After that, we get a list of things which you either must accept or not accept. So let me, this tablet is going to be my Bible for this morning. Most scholars regard Mark, and he's speaking about the Mark who wrote the Gospel of Mark, believe was written first of the synoptic gospels being Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is also one of the Gospels, but it's quite different from the other three, and they're called the Synoptic Gospels. He says, we can see the change of style when Matthew and Luke copy Mark. Obviously, one had to be written first. If three books are written, isn't it logical that one was written and the other two were written after the first one? It's also logical to see what that person has written, and if you agree with it totally or feel that it's not important enough for you to mention it in your writing of something similar. He says that it's considered the Q document. It comes from its German word for source, the source, the beginning. You can even go to ancient songs and early fragments. And whenever you encounter Jesus doing anything or saying anything attached to one of those records will be saying by Christ or a projection of a self-image that he has of himself. He considered himself good and wise. Dr. Scott is saying Jesus considered himself to be wise and good. He thought he was perfect. If I tell you I'm perfect, that's not a good thing. First of all, because I'm not. But Jesus was. So it is very appropriate for Jesus to believe himself to be good and wise, and for him to believe that he's perfect. This may be a little difficult to swallow. If your religion, hi Monkey Man, I had noticed that you had jumped in. We got the source of pure, very good. If your religion is based on emotion, some of what I'm going to read to you this morning is going to be kind of hard to swallow, because this is pure logic and intellectualism. And I'm giving you the words of a man whose intellect I admire, Dr. Eugene Scott, the late Dr. Scott. It doesn't matter whether he was. For our purposes of proving that Jesus walked out of the tomb, for that purpose, it doesn't make any difference whether Jesus believed himself to be perfect or not. There's nothing as despicable as a person who thinks he's never made a mistake. That conscious, self-righteous, perfectionist image is not something we respond to, because the wisdom of mankind combines the knowledge that nobody's perfect, but Jesus was not like us. Now, I'm reading from Dr. Scott, and I realize that reading is not the easiest thing to listen to. But I don't want to change his words, because his material is owned by somebody. It's copyrighted, and I don't want to infringe on that. He says, we don't make saints of people who think they're perfect, but Jesus thought he was. Everywhere you meet him, he projects that. He judges other people. See, it would be hard for me to go around judging people because I'm not perfect. But Jesus could judge other people because he was. That's logical. He calls other people whitened sepulchres, strain at a gnat, swallow a camel. He looks at the most righteous people of the day and puts them down. The reason that no man ought to judge, and any man who is a judge should have his sensitive conscience, that is, it's hard to judge your fellow man because we know way down deep that we have the same kind of faults as our fellow man. Dr. Scott says, but Jesus never had any sense of imperfection. He changed the law, saying, because we had an Old Testament law, He changed the law, saying, "You've heard it said unto you, but behold, I say," and then self-righteously, with a consciousness of moral perfection, says, "Think not that I have come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it." He changes it. He says, "I'm not destroying it. I'm simply fulfilling it." There is a possible exception to that. When the rich young ruler came to him and said, "Good master," and Jesus said, "Why callest thou me good?" Except for that one time. Jesus always believed and said he was good. He said at that time, "Don't come to me and call me a good rabbi or a good teacher. If you're going to call me good, also recognize that only God can be good." See, up till that time, Jesus had not called himself God. There was a time on Palm Sunday. These are my words, not Dr. Scott's. So don't trap the appellation onto me without recognizing that I'm also God. He had a moral sense of perfection, no sense of moral inadequacy, because he was totally adequate. It is ever exhibited everywhere in his behavior. So, number one, assumptions. Jesus thought he was perfect. Second assumption, he seated all authority in himself. Jesus said he was the authority. These are Dr. Scott's comments on that assumption. He even said he was all authority. You build on what I say. You build on a rock. You build on anything else, you build on sand. All authority in heaven and earth is given to me. Again, to point out another illustration he used, he said concerning the law, generations of approval have been placed on it. You've heard it said unto you, but behold, I say. He pronounced judgment without a flicker. Now, we don't make saints of people like that. We ask the criteria. On what do you base this authority? He based it on himself. Because I say unto you. My reason for telling you that I have all authority is because I do. So number two, he seated all authority in himself. I'm noticing on the video that we've got some technical problems. I don't know whether we're going to be able to overcome them or have to do this at another time. Number three. See, number one, these are assumptions. When we get through with a number of assumptions, we're going to go to a number of things which you either must accept and go on or stop in trying to prove that Jesus was resurrected. The first being that Jesus believed he was perfect. The second assumption, Jesus seated all authority in himself. 3, he put himself at the center of the religious universe, not just Judaism, but the religious universe. He went further and put himself at the center. Jesus didn't come preaching a doctrine or a truth apart from himself. Everything he preached had to do with himself. He said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. By me, if any man enter in, I am the door to the sheepfold. He that hateth not his father, mother, wife, children, brother, sister, yea, even his own life, and taketh up the cross, and come after me, cannot be my disciple. He made your relationship with him, putting him the center of the religious universe, the determinative of all religious beliefs. Number 3, he himself was the center of every religious universe. Number 3, he talked of the eternal from the inside. Most of us speak of something eternal as being way out there. Jesus is speaking of something eternal, lasting forever, not having any end. There's a certain frame of reference or familiarity with your home. For example, I may say the couch in my office at home is brown. You don't ask, how do you know? We speak of home with inside knowledge. You know it's your home, you've been there. Somebody else hasn't been in your home, cannot speak of that knowledge. But if it's something you're familiar with, if it's inside your home, we don't argue. We expect to be believed. My own comment now, giving you certain information about these birds. I don't expect you to say, prove the little one was 5 weeks old. I expect you to believe it. We don't argue. We expect to be believed. That's the frame of reference Jesus projects when he talks about eternity. Jesus doesn't expect us to argue with him. He expects us to believe him. He knows what he's talking about. We don't know very much about the subject. The only thing we know about the subject is what he's taught us. Matter of factly, he says, I'm going back. He's referring to John 14. I'm going to prepare a mansion for you, and after a while I'm coming back and get you and take you there. He says, matter of factly, before Abraham was, or I saw Satan cast down. Jesus, that we know to have been born as a baby in Bethlehem, says he remembers Abraham. Abraham was centuries before Jesus. And Jesus is saying, yeah, I know the guy. He's talking about Satan being cast out of heaven. 2 of the prophets talk about Satan being cast out of heaven. We know that happened between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Then we know Satan was cast out of heaven. And then the earth was void, and Jesus and God the Father and God the Son fixed it up. He's saying, oh yeah, I was in heaven the day that Satan was kicked out of heaven, over 4,000 years from the time Jesus said that. He says, before Abraham, I existed before Abraham. Or, I saw Satan cast down. Or, there's joy in heaven by the angels when a sinner repents. I know that. I've been in heaven. I've been there. He projected and would have us believe that he had inside knowledge of eternity and pre-earthly existence before, after, and inside the heavens of God. We've got 4 now, so let me read them. He thought he was perfect. He seated all authority in himself. He put himself at the center of the religious universe. He talked of the eternal from inside. 5. He would die and a ransom. He said something wrong with the whole world that could only be set right by him dying. He had to pay a ransom. In this context, where his hearers knew exactly what a ransom was, the ransom was what you paid to restore a lost inheritance, to deliver somebody that was destined to death. You know, you watch probably some whodunits on television. I found a station, if I happen to wake up in the middle of the night, that has some old-fashioned ones that I rather enjoy more than the faster-moving pace of the whodunits of today. Somebody, you steal somebody, and you'll give that person back if somebody will pay a ransom. He's talking to people who knew what a ransom was. To deliver somebody destined to death because of their error. It was the price paid to redeem from the consequences of falling short. Doing something wrong, losing an inheritance. The ransom restored you to what had been lost. He said the whole world was lost, and he came to die and pay the price of ransom to redeem them. He, one man, came to redeem the whole world. Number 6. Hang on. This is the last one of these suppositions. He said he would rise again. This is Easter morning. This is resurrection. That's what we're talking about today. Did he come out of that grave or didn't he? Number 6, he said he would rise again. There was more than just that, but I'm choosing selectively a few that when he died, he would raise from the dead. Now, Dr. Scott says, at the time he says this, he's pastoring the cathedral in Los Angeles. He says, now, if I, as pastor, walked up to the podium, I call it pulpit, at the cathedral and picked up the microphone and said, he says, suppose I walk up here and I say to my congregation, all authority in heaven and earth is given to me. You would think maybe pastor means he's going to quote Dr. Scott saying, you wouldn't expect me to walk up and tell you, all authority is given to me. If I said something like that, you figure I'm getting ready to quote scripture, right? You wouldn't figure I'm saying that of myself. So you might check that one off, that maybe this is the pastor emphasizing the authority of the word of God that he's reading from. But if I then went on and said, as though I were talking to God, here I am, Father. I've done all you sent me to do. There are no flaws in me, no imperfections. The law doesn't bother me. I have fulfilled it, and started claiming a perfection like Jesus did, you'd start backing up and start looking at me and have sympathy with my wife, Mrs. Scott. And if I further went on to say, your eternal destiny is dependent upon putting me in the center of your life and making me your master, by then I would have been interrupted and everybody would have thought I was off my rocker. I don't think I would have ever gotten to what I didn't include here, that I would have you think I was the denizen of eternity. He never thought all authority was seated in him. Wait a minute, let me back up. I had skipped a couple of paragraphs. And he's talking about a yogi. I don't want to, I'm not going to skip this because I don't want to change in any way. I'm giving you his word, not mine. And what if I were to stand up here and say, not in spiritual terms, but expecting to be believed? Dr. Scott says, what if I stood up here and Dr. Scott, said, before Abraham was, I was. You know, the guy that came out of Ur, I was there. I saw Satan when he was cast before Adam was ever born. And when I would talk about heaven with a familiarity about which we talk about our homes. If I tell you the couch in my home is beige, you say, how do you know? I'm going to reply, because I live there. But I'm claiming that kind of familiarity with heaven. That's what Jesus did. He talked about heaven, like he lived there, like he'd been there. Not like he read it in a book. That was my comment. You put people in a nut house, they talk like that. And then I would say that I was somehow a ransom for the world. Somebody help my wife lay hands on me before I'm a goner. Will you please stop to realize that this proclaimer of impossible things about himself is the only kind of Christ who walked around on the stage of history and is the only one you can find in the sources? You don't find other religious founders doing or saying these things that Jesus said. Buddha never thought he was perfect. He struggled with the essence of Tanya, which was their meaning for that corrupt desire that produces sin. He sought the way of the sensual release. He sought the way of aesthetic yogi, and neither one worked. He came to the Eightfold Path that brought him into a trance-like state where he lost conscious identity with life, called nirvana. And when he came out of that state, he offered those who followed him an Eightfold Path. All he could say was, "It worked for me, try it, it'll work for you." He's talking now about, I'm looking for it here. This is Muhammad. He is talking about Buddha. He never thought all authority was seated in him. He told his disciples it's part of their tripart basket of scriptures that he wasn't worthy to lead them. He just told them what worked for him. Muhammad never thought he was perfect. He was Allah's prophet. He had visions of eternity that impressed the desert man, but he never claimed to have been there. He never died as a ransom for anybody. He had a criteria for authority, said God revealed it to him in a vision. Jesus never pointed to a vision like the prophet who would say, "The Lord said," Jesus said, "I say." Confucius did a logical analysis of society, and he pointed to that eternal analysis as his authority. None of these other leaders made themselves the center of the religious universe. With Jesus, you've got what C.S. Lewis, another brilliant man, who considered himself of the order of a poached egg. Or you can take him what he says. If he is God, then he is perfect, and authority does rest in him. He is the center of the religious university. He did have the qualities necessary to die as a ransom for the whole world. If you don't have those qualities, you're dying for somebody. Doesn't do anybody any good. That's my comment. He did have the qualities necessary to die as a ransom for the whole world. He did have a knowledge of eternity, and he will and did rise again. Okay. I'm skipping several paragraphs. In those days, you could assemble eyewitnesses, not today. Now, this is my comment. Why can't you assemble eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection? Because it's been 2,000 years ago. There are no eyewitnesses alive. But in the time we're talking about, those first couple of months after Jesus' resurrection, it was possible to assemble eyewitnesses. But like any other fact from history, from who wrote Shakespeare to Julius Caesar's existence, You can look for the fact of history on which Christianity is based, namely, Jesus came out of the tomb. Christianity is alive because Jesus Christ came out of the tomb. If Jesus Christ didn't come out of the tomb, I'm not saved. This is me talking. I'm setting Dr. Scott aside for a moment. If Jesus Christ didn't come out of the tomb, I can't be saved. If Jesus Christ didn't come out of the tomb, he can't go to heaven and prepare a place for me and take me there. If Jesus Christ didn't come out of the tomb, his dying on the cross isn't doing me any good. Now that's the end of my comment, and I'm going back to Dr. Scott's. And I will say, to set the frame, that if any person listening came into the cathedral, this is written what he preached. If anybody came into the cathedral and making the claims Jesus made for himself, I would offer the suggestion that they should submit to a psychoanalysis and go to a hospital. He's saying, anybody comes in here and says, I'm perfect? Anybody comes into this cathedral and says, all religious things that the whole universe is based in me? I'd suggest he was crazy and ought to be psychoanalyzed. Unless he says, I thought they were putting me on. No mortal man can make these claims. But if with the claims the person says, slay me and in 3 days I'll come out of the tomb and sail off into the blue, and 3 days later that same person came out of the tomb and sailed off into the blue, I'll take another look at the one who makes the claims. I don't need anything else as a basis for my faith. I don't need all the fancy philosophic Trinitarian doctrines. This resurrected one, if it happened, is my starting point for a personal and real God. To repeat what Dr. Scott said, if a man came into my church and made these kind of statements, I'd say he was crazy, unless he could produce it. If he says I'm going to die, and he dies. If he says I'm going to be resurrected from the dead, and he walks out of the tomb, then I believe in him. Not because he says what he's going to do, but because he actually pulled it off. Back to Dr. Scott. Then he becomes the resurrected one, and it is the starting point for a personal and real God. Everything that happened before that is important, but this makes it final. Without this, we could forget the rest. I can find on the stage of history the one whose words I can spend my life researching, and Dr. Scott did, who was perfect, the center of all authority, the center of the religious universe, and all of these things, including having redeemed me, says Dr. Scott, raised and prepared mansions in eternity. That's all the God I need. I start right here. Now, he has prepared the stage with these assumptions. Now we go to the issue. Did he come out of the tomb? Let me get my half hot chocolate, half decaf coffee here. The issue is, did he come out of the tomb? You won't settle that by thinking about it. You can sit there and think about it, and it's not going to do you any good. You research it. Now, to research anything, you have to get a foundation in facts. Most people are fuzzy-minded. They argue about a resurrection didn't occur because it can occur. People will say, well, Jesus wasn't raised from the dead because people can't be raised from the dead. That is not good logic. Most people are fuzzy-minded. They argue a resurrection didn't occur because it can occur. And anybody who says it must be lying. Any other fact, you research it. Y'all know that I have people come on my program and make statements. And they don't make any sense at all. But they make them. If you have what you believe is a fact, research it, prove it. If somebody says, well, I don't believe you were there. Oh, I back up. You're going to ask, did Dr. Scott preach this message within an hour on a specific Sunday? Suppose somebody said Dr. Scott preached a sermon on a particular Sunday within an hour. You've got to assume that the cathedral exists. If you're going to believe that statement, you've got to believe that there is a place where he preached it, right? You've got to assume that that Sunday came and went, that there was a particular Sunday. We don't have to discuss that. We take those facts for granted when determining if the message was less than an hour before we argue whether I preached an hour or more. Let's at least agree that I preached. Most people can't handle this kind of logic. And you may just have to take this by faith. But this is how you research. When I was working on my master's degree, I didn't want to do what the university wanted me to do. I'm talking about myself now. I didn't want to do what the university wanted me to do. I wanted to prepare a television program or something that would be of benefit to somebody, not just something that's sitting around in the university now, a book that people could go read. But mine had to do, I was in the field of education, mine had to do with multiple languages and with music. So that meant that I had to have an advisor in the field of music so that I didn't print something in a book that was going to sit in this university library, which was not correct back. I had to have another one in Spanish and English and Hispanic, South Mexican, Central, and South American Indian culture, and in the field of education. They said, we're not going to give you 3 advisors. And they made me take a class in research. We want you to learn to do the research so you can do it without these advisors. It's not a matter of opinion when you're talking university and you're talking about proof. Now, that just had to do with my master's degree. Dr. Scott here is talking about, did Jesus walk out of the tomb? Before we argue whether I preached, you don't have to agree whether it was good or bad, but that my mouth moved and I said things. That's the frame of reference, and that's taken for granted. You need to approach the resurrection the same way. There are certain facts that have to be assumed before you discuss the resurrection. Before we talk about did Jesus walk out of the tomb, there are certain things we've got to discuss. Did Jesus live at all? If Jesus didn't live at all, then he didn't die, then he wasn't buried, then he didn't walk out of the tomb. It's much easier to prove that I was here than to prove how long I preached. The very fact that you're alive is easy to prove. A little harder to prove how long you preached. Before we discuss whether the sermon was good or bad. If somebody says, wow, I don't believe you were there, then stop debating clocks. Let's not talk about how long the sermon is if we don't agree that I was there and preached. What was it? The preliminary remarks? Was it the first mark on the board because he would write things up on the board? When exactly did I start? That's debatable. But to prove whether I was here or not, that's easier. You need to approach the resurrection the same way. There are certain facts that have to be assumed before you discuss the resurrection. One is, did Jesus live at all? Why are we debating whether he was raised if we don't believe he lived? There was a time that was debated. I could see in my mind people who don't believe Jesus ever lived discussing the resurrection, because there are people that will argue about anything, even though it doesn't make sense, that they just argue. That's them. They will argue whether Jesus in truth walked out of the tomb, but will not necessarily agree with you that Jesus ever lived. It's foolishness. But we know people like that, don't we? There was a time that was debated, not so much anymore. For purposes of today, and any meaningful discussion of the resurrection, there are some facts we're going to assume. And he has, just like I mentioned facts before, that Jesus believed himself to be perfect, that Jesus believed himself to be the center of the religious universe, all those things. Now we have another list of things that we must at least assume before we can discuss whether Jesus walked out of the tomb. Fact number one, Jesus lived. If you don't think Jesus lived, why are we discussing if he walked out of the tomb? You don't believe that? Do you agree it's probably easier to prove that he lived somewhere, sometime, than that he died and rose again? You agree with that? So give me the easier task. Well, I'm not sure he lived, so don't give me that resurrection bit. I have more time to do other things than that. Don't get into an argument about the resurrection with somebody who doesn't believe Jesus lived. That's easy to prove. Until that's crossed, you don't get to the next one. Now, what's the next one? Fact two, that he was crucified at the instigation of certain Jewish religious leaders in Jerusalem. Roman authorities ordered and carried out the execution. There have been religious Jews, and there have been Jews who have converted to Christianity who have asked me, because it has to do with their culture, and they've asked me, Pastor Barbara, did the Jews kill Jesus or did the Romans kill him? The Romans did the deed because the Jews did not have the authority to take human life. The Romans were in charge. But the Jewish religious leaders did not have the authority to kill him. And the Romans would not kill him for the things that the Jewish leaders accused him of. So they had to lie. So the Romans did the deal. The Jewish leaders brought it about, and it was through their lies and other sins. So, that's actually what happened. Not all Jews. They weren't to blame for that. His disciples were Jews, just certain Jewish leaders. The Romans carried out the execution. Unless you believe that, there's no sense going to the resurrection. The crucifixion's much easier to prove than the resurrection. I suggested to my viewers and my people on Facebook and Twitter that you review during this season a message on YouTube. This particular message, you will not find it under Preacher with Parrots. It was put up there 7 or 8 years ago when I was putting messages up on YouTube as Mountain Christian Preacher. Mountain Preacher Lady. And it's all written as one word, and each word begins with a capital, if you want to look it up, if you haven't seen it. It talks about what the Romans and what the Jews were doing during the time Jesus was in the tomb, between the time he breathed his last and the women spoke to him in the tomb. If you haven't seen that, I suggest you view it. It's a lot easier to prove that he lived than it is to prove that he walked out of the tomb. That was fact 2. Fact 3, that he was considered dead. Yeah. This is me commenting on what I know to be fact and what Dr. Scott has said. There are a few people who thinks he didn't die. Or at least it's something they propose that they believe. That Jesus really didn't die. That he was half dead. He was knocked out. He was unconscious. They put perfume on his body and wrapped him up, put him in the tomb. It was getting ready to be a religious holiday. They had to leave the tomb. But somehow he revived, and in his weakened condition was able to push the stone away and walk out. There are a few people who believe that. So you have to believe, if you're going to discuss, not prove, but just discuss whether Jesus walked out of the tomb, you got to determine that he was considered dead, that many people, except for those few, most people believed he was dead. If you can't believe he was considered to be dead, any discussion of walking out of the tomb is crazy. Notice I said considered death. Oh, here Dr. Scott discusses it. A few people believe he recovered from the grave, resuscitated. He was considered dead, pierced with a sword, taken down from the cross, taken to a grave. Of course, one theorist has come up with a concoction that Jesus practiced this, seeing if it was possible to do, and that he practiced it on Lazarus. I mean, come up with something. You're going to get some fool somewhere that's going to come up with something unreal. But of course, Lazarus was thinking before he started practicing. Some of the theories stretch the brain more than just accepting the resurrection. If you think it's hard on the brain to accept the resurrection, imagine how you have to stretch the brain to believe some of the things that some people tell us. Fact 4, he was buried in a known accessible tomb. People of that day, and particularly the Jewish and Roman leaders who participated in the crucifixion events, knew where the tomb was and they could get to it. You couldn't get into it because of the rock. The guards there, and the tomb's location was known and accessible. Um, if you read the scripture or view that video, the title of it was What Happened on Saturday. Mountain Preacher Lady. The title of it, What Happened on Saturday. It tells you about the guards. They put guards, they put a big rock, and they did everything possible to keep somebody from stealing the body. But, do you agree with this? People knew where the tomb was. The Bible says that these ladies followed from the cross. They followed Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, the two who prepared his body for burial. They followed from the cross to the tomb because they wanted to know where it was. Because in a few minutes, it would be Feast of the Passover, and they couldn't do work. But the minute they could do work on Sunday morning, they wanted to prepare spices and go prepare his body. They had no idea what Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had done. They had to get to their house before sundown. So the tomb was known where it was. Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy, known person. It was no secret that he had a grave somewhere. He asked Pilate for permission to put Jesus' body in his grave. People followed. People knew where it was. It was no secret. It's a fact. He was buried in a known, accessible tomb. It was known where he was buried, and people that were there at that time could have gone there if they'd wanted to. In fact, there were Roman soldiers there. There were Roman guards there, and etc. Fact 5. He was then preached, raised. The apostles, the disciples, church planners immediately began preaching he was raised. You will hear sermons tonight, because today is Easter Sunday, about the men on the way to Emmaus, and somebody who had been in Jerusalem discusses with them the fact that Jesus was raised from the dead. Before the day was over, he was already preached as having been raised. I'm at this point of saying he raised, but he was preached raised, that the tomb was empty, that Jesus ascended. It's important to remember that the whole preachment, not parchment, preachment, included empty tomb, raised from the dead, ascending into heaven. All three of these claims were preached. Now, if you don't believe he was preached with those claims, I'm doing it today, says Dr. Scott. But he was preached early on in the same city where he was killed. If you don't believe that the series of claims were preached, that's easier to prove than the resurrection. You see, we can't even discuss the resurrection if you do not believe that it was preached, that he died, was resurrected, and ascended into heaven. If you can't handle he died, he was resurrected, he ascended into heaven, you can't believe. We can't even discuss the resurrection. Fact 6. The Jewish leaders who instigated the crucifixion were more interested in disproving his resurrection than we would be today. Dr. Scott goes and explains why, and I have mentioned this recently myself. Common sense, this is Dr. Scott says. Common sense will tell you the Jewish leaders who instigated the crucifixion had more interest in disproving the resurrection than somebody 2,000 years removed, considering it intellectually with a lot of skepticism mixed in, because the Jewish leaders' reputations, their bread and butter, their lives were at stake. If they instigated his crucifixion, accused him of trying to set up a kingdom, and accused him of blasphemy, that's what they told that's what they told Pilate, that's what they told the Romans. If they did that, and then all of a sudden it's true that he's raised from the dead, they're going to be looking for new jobs. So common sense says they had more psychological interest in disproving the theory and would put themselves out a little bit more than the people on Easter Sunday would. If you listen to my message, or go back in the Bible and see what happened between the time Jesus died on the cross and the time he was resurrected, you will see that while the little old ladies that followed the two men to the tomb to see where Jesus was going to be buried, that these women practiced their faith. They did not work on a holy feast day. What did the Jewish temple religious leaders do during that time when they shouldn't be working? They were out looking for the guards, offering them money. Get that video if you get a chance to. It, if not proves, at least teaches this fact. They had a lot more at stake than we do. With us, it's our religion. With them, it was their livelihood. Fact 7. And there are, there are 8. Fact 7. The disciples were persecuted because of preaching the claims of his resurrection. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but Christians in general became a target for the evils of the Roman Empire. They were persecuted because they preached the resurrection, not because they preached his death. Many good men have died for a cause they believed in. Let's go now to another fact. The tomb was empty. Dr. Scott says, all this leads to the fact common sense says if the Jewish leaders who instigated the crucifixion had an extra interest because of their livelihood, and if he was buried in a known accessible tomb, if he was buried at a place that people knew where it was and they could get there and check it out. Whether they did or not is not important. The fact is, he was in a place they could have gone and checked it out. They would have gone immediately to the tomb and discovered the body. Therefore, it is axiomatic that the tomb was empty. Whether they went or not is not important. They could have. And the fact that proof was available makes it axiomatic that the tomb was empty. The tomb became meaningless because it was empty. There's no importance in the tomb. Jesus isn't there. Centuries went by and the tomb was lost to history because there was no body in it. The tomb is a cave. There are a lot of caves in Jerusalem. The tomb became meaningless because it was empty. Centuries went by and the tomb was lost to history because there was no body in it. And the whole church I'm going to go. Then When this relic period began to grow, people got interested in his tomb, in which there had been no interest because there was no body in it, and they tried to find it. Why would you do all this work to find a grave that had a body in it? There's nothing unusual about a grave with a body in it, right? There is something unusual about a grave without a body in it. And it goes to mention that there are two places in Jerusalem, both claiming to be the tomb. I have been in both and hope to, in a few months, return. The whole church would still be fighting today over it. If there would not be arguing over which of these two places is it. If they won't birth empty, why would there be a discussion? Now, these facts are easier to demonstrate than the resurrection. But unless these facts are accepted, you can't deal with the theories of the resurrection. What do we have to accept? I'm going to go back and read them. That Jesus lived. That he was crucified at the instigation of certain Jewish religious leaders in Jerusalem. That he was considered dead. That he was buried in a known, accessible tomb. That he was preached to have been raised. That Jewish leaders who instigated the crucifixion were more interested in disproving the resurrection than we are today. That the disciples were persecuted because they preached and made claims about his resurrection. And that the tomb was empty. Those are easier to prove. But unless these facts are accepted, you can't deal with the theories about the resurrection. For example, the preaching has been so effective that all through the centuries, people have come up with theories to explain it. Now, the reason I do this every Easter, this is Dr. Scott, because he preached it once, and then he began preaching the same message every Easter, is that I try to demonstrate that you don't have to park your brains at the door of the church when you come in. Intelligent analysis is in order. This is not just a matter of faith. It is something that intelligent people can consider to have been proved. That last was my comment. My quarrel is with people who deny the resurrection and live a lifestyle that pays no attention to it. I can ask them 15 questions and find they've spent 15 hours of their life looking at evidence for it. If the resurrection is true, this is the center of the universe. If this is true, if Jesus walked out of that tomb, then this is the center of the universe. That's the most important thing that's ever happened. If the resurrection is true, this is the central fact of history. You have to be a fool among all fools of mankind to think it's not worth at least 30 hours of study in your whole life. How can somebody who hasn't even read, this is my comment, the scriptural reference, hasn't even spent a few hours on it, wants to get up and argue, well, I just don't believe it, it never happened, and hasn't put even a minimal effort into it? You have to be a fool. Furthermore, there are many intelligent people in the world who have looked and come away convinced. That's why I'm doing this, says Dr. Scott, because the disciples' preachments are so sincere in their nature. All kinds of theories have been broached to explain their belief. But the theories won't fly if you assume the 8 facts previously stated. Here are some theories. If Jesus wasn't resurrected, then you've got to believe some of these theories. Number one, the disciples stole the body. For these first three, Dr. Scott doesn't give any comments. I will give you a comment. You could believe the disciples stole it because they followed a man who said he would raise from the dead. If his body was still in the grave, it wouldn't look good for their teacher. So to make their teacher look good, they steal the body. You could believe that. Or you could believe the Jewish leaders stole it. Why would the Jewish leaders want to steal it? Why would you want to believe that? Because it would cover up what they did. You could believe the Romans stole it because they entered into collusion with the Jewish leaders. This last one gets me, and Dr. Scott comments on it. This one gets me. You could believe the women went to the wrong tomb. You know, it was dark. They got lost. They didn't have women drivers, but they had women walkers. They walked to the wrong tomb, and they believed he rose, and I mean, they ran screaming and crying out of the garden, and they said, we win, and he wasn't there, and they went to the wrong tomb. They went to an empty one that was waiting for somebody else. Didn't have a body in it because the person who was going to be buried in that tomb hadn't died yet. Theory number 5. They could believe it was a hallucination. Glorified daydreams. Sincere, they believed it would happen because they had hallucinations. Then theory 6, which we mentioned before, where the guy really wasn't total, where Jesus wasn't totally dead, and he got a little better Friday night, Saturday, late Saturday, got a little better, got his strength back and walked out. That's the resuscitation theory. He was crucified and he was considered dead and he was buried in a known tomb, but he wasn't dead. In the coolness of the tomb, he revived, came out wrapped in grave clothes. Thank God the guards were asleep, and he pushed the rock out of the way, and here comes Frankenstein, says Dr. Scott. Or theory 7, you could believe that the disciples lied. Or theory 8, you could believe it's true. They're telling exactly what they experienced and what they saw. Now, just as you got the startling alternate, when you consider the only Jesus in history, that he's either a madman, a nut, a faker, or he's what he said he was. And that requires a definition of divinity. You have a startling alternative here. All these theories sound good in isolation. What does that mean? When you look at something in isolation, you look at it all by itself, not the other facts that surround it, but just one. He says, even the first theory that the disciples stole the body, which the Jewish leaders themselves concocted. But this theory on its face forces you to indict the disciples as liars. Not only as the Jewish religious leaders for doing it, but the disciples would have had to have known it, and they were preaching something different. They would be liars. I've always hated it when I was doing my degree in history. I hate a self-righteous objective historian. I'm objective. I take no opinion. There's no such thing as a knowledgeable person that doesn't have an opinion. Knowledge forces an opinion. If you know something, you have to believe something, right? No exposure to facts keeps you neutral. As soon as you know some stuff, you have an opinion. As soon as you know a fact, you can't say, well, it could have been this or it could have been the other. If you know a fact, you know a fact. And when you study the facts about Jesus listed above, there's only two options allowed. Either the disciples lied or they honestly reported the truth. Let's examine each theory and deduce the option. Remember, either they lied or they told the truth. It's come down to this. They stole the body. That was theory one. So that's the case. They lied. The Jewish leaders stole the body. That's theory two. These facts preclude that they were more concerned than anyone to disprove the preachment that he was in fact resurrected. So why would they want to make the tomb empty? I mean, they were trying to prove he wasn't King of the Jews, that he wasn't the Son of God. So why would they want to prove an empty tomb? It would not be to their advantage. An empty tomb means Jesus was God. And if they had, they would have said, wait a minute, we took his body from the tomb. They couldn't even think of that story. They told the one about the disciples. But even if that were tenable, the disciples didn't preach just an empty tomb and the resurrection. They preached a seen and living Jesus with whom they partook food. The disciples didn't just tell the world or anybody that would listen, well, Jesus was resurrected. They went beyond that. They ate food with him and many more things. They preached a living Jesus that they partook food with. They preached the ascension with vigor. So even if the Jewish leaders taking the body could explain an empty tomb, the disciples are still telling the add-ons when encounters with the resurrected body and the ascension. So they've expanded and made up a lot of story. In other words, they're still lying. 3. Roman leaders took the body. That's theory 3. With the controversies in Jerusalem, with the contracts that made with the Romans enabling them to get the crucifixion done, don't you think they would have exposed that fact that officials of the Roman government took the body? But even if that explains the empty tomb, it does not alleviate the disciples' responsibility for preaching the resurrected body that they had encounters with and the ascension. So they're still lying. The woman went to the wrong tomb. It was a known, accessible tomb. Hallucinations? Well, the empty tomb, blast that. If it had been hallucinations, there would be a body in the tomb. Somebody coming to crazy conclusions and having some type of an emotional or mental experience, that would have not made the body disappear. So no matter how you look at it, if you assume these 8 facts, they're easier to demonstrate than the resurrection. That's why I have no, says Dr. Scott, I have no respect for those who deny the resurrection and have not read the classic Sherlock's Trials of the Witnesses. I didn't know something like that had been written. I probably need to look into it. He postulated a courtroom scene where there were witnesses that were gathered and subjected to the kind of evidence of an English court, or they haven't read Who Moved the Stone, something written by an attorney who set out to disprove the resurrection and ended up by writing one of the most convincing proof arguments. You are faced with the startling alternative. Option one, these disciples made the story up to save the face and the whole thing is a lie. Or they're telling the truth and they're honest men. The disciples told the truth or the disciples lied. When you come down, examine all of these facts, it comes down, the disciples told the truth, he was resurrected, or the disciples lied and he wasn't resurrected. Now, if you're having trouble distinguishing between facts and opinions and theories, let me make it clear. The 8 facts that there was, well, let's go to them. The 8 facts. Jesus lived. He was crucified at the instigation of Jewish leaders. He was considered dead. He was buried in a known, accessible tomb. It was then preached that he was raised. The Jewish leaders in those days found it more important to discuss this and come out right than people today would be, and disciples were persecuted and the tomb was empty. The disciples stole it, the Jewish leaders stole it, the Romans stole it, the women went to the wrong tomb. That one I love. The resuscitation, that one I love. He just got better and walked right out. The disciples lied. It's all true. Now, we have some reasons, and we are an hour and 22 minutes into this. I realize we've got some time going here, but I'm almost through, and I want to do Dr. Scott's theory justice. When we come to the point the entire Christian faith revolves around the question, did the disciples lie or did they tell the truth? We've already considered everything else. Reason 1. He says there are 4 reasons, Dr. Scott says, he can't believe they lied. 1 was cataclysmic change for the better on the part of the witnesses. I'm going to just read his reasons now because of time. And I will tell you again how to get this so you can read it yourself if you would like to. I want to do Dr. Scott's work justice. I want to be as intellectually honest as he has been. The lives of these men were better because Jesus was resurrected than if they had lied and he was not. Reason number 2, indirect evidences and internal consistencies. He talks about what they themselves wrote. Now, Jesus did refer to himself as the Son of Man because Jesus was preaching to a Hebrew audience that read the book of Enoch, a book which I have read. It's not in the Bible, but it is an authoritative, historically correct book. Some of you have even heard the research I did to prove that the flood came at the time it did as a result of one of Enoch's predictions. Jesus had read the book of Enoch and he'd read the book of Daniel, where the Son of Man was viewed as himself, as Son of Man and a Messiah mentality. But if you're writing to Gentiles who don't know the Old Testament and trying to perpetrate a lie that Jesus is the Son of God, unless you're basically an honest person telling the truth, you wouldn't have Jesus say Son of Man as often as he did. Why not change what he said to serve your purpose? Inerrant honesty, I could give you a dozen of those, but this is what historians call indirect evidence of honesty. Number 3, the price that was paid. You don't pay the price these men paid and then tell a lie. Reason 4, these disciples, they died alone. It's true, he came out of the grave. I'm winding up about 3 paragraphs. Well, if it's true, then what? All the rest is true. And I have a starting point for a faith in God eternal. And I then have crossed over the threshold where I can now comprehend that Christianity is. For if I can believe that Jesus Christ came through those grave clothes, through that rock, through that door, and sailed off into the blue, then molecular displacement is nothing. Molecular displacement is my hand cannot go through this because the molecules in my hand will hit the molecules in this, meaning that Jesus could pass through a door that's closed or a wall because he could arrange the molecules in the door. Now, I'm not a scientist. I'm doing my best to, a foolish person trying to explain a very difficult concept. Okay. Then molecular displacement is nothing to him. He can do it without creating an explosion. It's true that all things consist in him, and he can control them. Therefore, it's not difficult at all to believe that the same substance that God placed in Mary, because that's a hard one to understand, right? The Holy Spirit putting Jesus, essence, Son of God, in the Virgin Mary. That's hard. But not if Jesus is able to control molecular displacement. Therefore, it's not at all hard to believe that the same substance of God placed in Mary came forth as Jesus of Nazareth through the Holy Spirit. God says he places the same God substance in us when we trust him. This is the true born-again experience, a generator that generates, that begins life. A regeneration, a new creature that penetrates my cell structure and is placed in me as a gift from God when I connect by trusting his word. That's the genesis of all Christianity, properly seeing that Jesus in us, the hope of glory. I don't have to have become a mystic or a far-out freak to understand what Christianity is. I can now spend my life pursuing Jesus' words, including the authority he attaches to the Old Testament and the promises that are written therein. And each time I grab hold of those and act on my belief and sustain the action and confidence, that faith connection keeps in me a life substance the same as that which raised up Christ from the dead. That new life substance is as capable of changing my nature, this is heavy, as radioactive material, invisible though it may be, can change your cell structure as you hold it. God puts a life in us capable of regenerating. And that's why spirituality, this is the last paragraph, that's why spirituality is the expression of the Spirit, and why righteousness is called the fruit of the Spirit. It is that new life growing out through us which can only be maintained by faith in his word. But it was founded and baked upon that solid rock of the provable quality he raised from the dead. It gives me faith to believe he will do the other thing he said, which is yet to come. Now it says here, click here to learn more about God's angry man, which is a name some have given the late Dr. Gene Scott. And when you click, you get this. I want to tell you how you can get this yourself. You can go to godsangryman.com, or you can go to well, I've lost it. I will put it in the comments at the bottom on YouTube, and I will also put it in Facebook. It's been a long time. It's been an hour and 31 minutes and 12 seconds. I think it's a fascinating discussion. I think every Christian should be exposed to this sermon. And that's why I wanted to present it to you. So until the next video, blessings on you. Bye-bye.